Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, checking out this new album from Turnstile, Never Enough. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So Turnstile just released their fourth studio album on June 6th, but the band started way back in 2010 in Baltimore, Maryland, but they didn't release their first studio album until 2015. Since then, they've released Time and Space in 2018, and then Glow On in 2021, each with increasing popularity with each album. Their biggest album to date was their last, which is Glow On. It was the first album to chart in the Billboard 200 here in the US, peaking at number 30 and it hit number 1 on the Billboard Hard Rock chart. Coming off of Glow On, the band was nominated for 3 Grammy Awards for Best Metal Performance, Best Rock Performance, and Best Rock Song. They would lose 2 of those to Brandi Carlile, and the third they would lose to Ozzy. And when Turnstile started back in 2010, they were very much a straightforward, hardcore punk band. And then over the years, they've evolved their sound to what it is today. If you go back and listen to their debut album, Non-Stop Feeling, and then listen to Never Enough, I think most people would swear that they're 2 completely different bands. And the albums released in between those, each album was more and more progressive or experimental as they went on through their career. And that experimentation would take them further and further away from their original sound. But with Glow On, the band shifted to this more alternative rock, shoegaze kind of style. They still had some of that harder edge that they had earlier in their career, but like I said, if you go back and listen to their first, album and a half, it sounds very different than what Glow On and Never Enough are. And it was after Glow On came out, and the popularity the band had because of that album, that Blink-182 would pick them to open for them on their reunion tour back in 2023. And that tour would expose them to an audience that, Turnstile would just never be able to reach on their own. I do have to admit that that was my first real experience with the band. I'd heard a couple of songs from them before that tour, but I think it was the run-up to that tour. I think it was after Blink-182 announced that Turnstile was going to be opening for them is when I started kind of going back through their first several albums. But before that, I don't think I'd ever listened to an entire album from them and probably only heard maybe 4 or 5 songs in total. And outside the 4 studio albums, they have released a number of singles over the years. I think there's been 6 or 7 that they've released since 2011. And with Never Enough, it sounds like the band has moved even further away from that hardcore punk sound that they had earlier in their career, even more so than they did on Glow On. When a band goes through such a seismic shift musically, you're always going to turn some people off. I mean, first off, you're never ever going to be able to make all your fans happy anyway, but when you go through such a big change musically, a lot of fans, especially your older fans, I think they tend to struggle a little bit with the newer sound. For Never Enough, the band would bring in Will Yip to help co-produce on this one, which they worked with previously on their second album, Time and Space. And Will's had a pretty distinguished career up until this point. I mean, he's worked with The Wonder Years, he's worked with Panic at the Disco, he's worked with Arctic Monkeys, he's worked with The Bouncing Souls, The Fray, he's even worked with Lauryn Hill. But Never Enough is a big album for the band because it's the first album since Brady Ebert, who was their founding guitarist, left the band in 2022. Meg Mills filled in for him as a touring guitarist for a while, and then she finally officially joined the band. To be fair, I'm unfamiliar with I think any of the bands she's worked in previously, but she does a great job on this album. And I was interested to see how the change in guitarist would alter the tone and overall feel of the band, because that's what happens when you have a founding guitarist leave after, 3 albums, 4 albums, and you bring in somebody new, it can have a completely different change in the feel of the band. I think Never Enough marks a very significant change in the evolution of the band because they use, I think, a wider array of musical influences on this album. They still do have some of that punk influence on there, but I think it's less on this album than anything before. And of their 4 studio albums, I think this is easily their most experimental. The one thing I noticed right away on this new album is every song individually has a very different sound to it. And some people listening to this album might say or have the feeling it's a little bit disjointed, a little bit of a jarring sound going from track to track. But I like the variation. I like listening to an album that doesn't have the same kind of general sound overall, which a lot of newer bands and a lot of newer rock bands have that problem, where you sit down and listen to an album and yes, the 12 or 13 songs in the album might all be lyrically different and musically there's going to be some differences, but they always have that same kind of, general tone to them. That's not the case with this album. I think it lends itself to the more experimental feeling on the album. And even though, yes, it might sound out of place at times, I think it adds a completely different layer to the album. So the album's got 14 tracks, comes in a little bit over 45 minutes long, and when you sit down and listen to this album, when I saw it was 45 minutes long, I was a little surprised. It does not feel that long, which I think is a big positive for an album, because a lot of times you'll sit down, especially with an album like this where there are like these longer instrumental passages on the album. Sometimes it can feel a little long and drawn out, but it doesn't feel that way listening to this album, I don't think. I think today, more so than any time in the history of rock music, I think the opening track on an album is so important, because in the streaming age we live in, a lot of people sit down and they'll listen to the first track or the first 2 or 3 tracks, and if nothing's there to kind of pull them into the album, they'll just kind of move on to something else. So the first opening track is very important because it sets the tone for the album. I think it sets the expectations for the album also, and you really never get a second chance to make that first impression again. So you don't want to turn your fans off before the album even gets started. And with that being said, the album kicks off with the title track, Never Enough, and it starts off with this minute-long ambient kind of style to the beginning of the song before, I'd say, a more traditional Turnstile kind of sound kicks in. And the song ended up being more rhythmic than I thought it was going to be, judging by the first minute of the track. Because going into the beginning of the song, I really didn't know what to expect on this track. And while I think there's better songs they could have picked off this album to be the lead track, I understand why they picked this song, because it does do a good job of fusing those more like ambient interludes in with the heavier riffs that Turnstile is known for. So in that way, it does kind of set the feel for the album, but I think there's a couple other songs they probably would have had a better pick to lead the album off. I think picking a song that was maybe a little bit heavier, a little less ambient at times, even though, like I said, those ambient themes kind of, flow throughout this album, picking something a little more heavier, a little more higher energy to start the album, I think would have been a better pick overall. I think that's mainly because, if you've never listened to Turnstile before and you listen to this very first track, like I said, the first minute of it, you're going to think you're getting yourself into something completely different than what some of the other songs on this album are, especially when you compare it to older albums from Turnstile. And if I was sequencing the tracks on this album, I actually would have flipped the first track and the second track. Soul is the second track. It has that higher energy that I think would have worked better as an opening song on the album. And it's a song that took a couple of listens to really grow on me. Like, I thought it was a good song the very first time I listened to it. It has that, like, if you listen to Glow On, it has that feeling that Glow On had. That's why, like, the first time I listened to this album, I thought this was a track that probably was written during those Glow On sessions, but was never used on that album. And style-wise, I think it fits in with a lot of the other songs on this album. And that's why I think it would have been a good song to start the album off with. And the reason I say it sounds similar to Glow On is because Glow On was the first album from Turnstile that had that very, like, poppy kind of sheen to their music. And that's the feel I got from this song, even though it does have some of that higher energy, a little heavier tone to it. Than some of the other songs on this album does. Go back and listen to Glow On. I think that's where that sound really kind of started with Turnstile, and they're continuing it and kind of building upon that with Never Enough. And then comes one of my favorite songs on this album, I Care. It sounds like it was like ripped right out of a 80s synth pop band, even though it does have some of those harder edges kind of blended in with it. It has this oddly fascinating blend to it because it's like I said, it's got this like nostalgic 80s synth pop sound to it, but it's also blending in with this newer sound from Turnstile. I think it might be one of the best tracks of Turnstile's career. And then that takes us to the song Dreaming, and I think this is a good song, but it has this horn section in it that it just sounds out of place. And it does reappear a couple of times throughout the song, and I think had they taken that out, it would have been an even better song. And I think the title of the song fits perfectly because it sounds like it has this like walking through a dream kind of sound to it with these haunting vocals kind of blended in. It's just the horns that, for me, just don't fit in this song. Light Design is a pretty short song. I think it's like right around or just over 2 minutes long. And it's kind of a completely opposite song from I Care, where I Care has that like I said, 80s synth pop sound that's really strong in that one, blended in with some of that newer Turnstile vibe, where this song is a complete opposite. It's more of that, you hear more Turnstile with this song, and then it has a little bit of that blending of that 80s synth pop in it. Dull is a song that I think perfectly fits the title of the track. It's not horrible. I would say this is probably my first skip on the album. It's not a bad song. I just don't think it adds a whole lot to the album. And to be completely honest, like if I stream this album, it's a song I skip right over. And if you're a fan of older Turnstile, there is a couple of those harder songs on this album. Sun Shower is one of them. It sounds like a vintage Turnstile song with the energy, and this song is probably the closest on this album to anything the band did on their first album and a half. Except for the song ends with 2 minutes of ambient music. It's got this flute that, same thing with the horn. A couple songs before. The flute, I think you could just let that out of there. I think it would have been just as good, maybe a little bit better, had not been in there. And then the ambient sound kind of blends right into the next song, Look Out For Me, which is the longest song on the album, coming in at almost 7 minutes long. And as that ambient sound blends into the song, it quickly progresses to this harder style from Turnstile before kind of drifting back into this like dreamy ending towards the end. It's, like I said, 7 minute long song. I give Turnstile a lot of credit for not cutting the song down or chopping up into multiple songs, because I think the experimental side of this song in particular really shows the maturity and the growth that Turnstile has made over the last decade and a half. And then the longest song on the album is followed up by the shortest song on the album. Ceiling comes in, I think it's like 1 minute and 13 or 14 seconds. It's another one of those tracks where I could probably do without this one. It's short, doesn't have a whole lot to it, doesn't add a whole lot to the album. And then that brings me to the song Seeing Stars, which is not only, I think, the best song on this album, it's probably my favorite song of the year so far. It very much has this ripped from the 80s kind of sound to it, and it sounds really familiar. I mean, it sounds so familiar that when I first sat down and listened to or read through the track listing on here, I thought this was a cover song. It sounds that familiar, but I still haven't been able to really put my finger on what exactly it sounds like. And as much as I like some of the other songs on this album, I would love to see Turnstile do more of a full album with a style like this. And then Bird starts out with this like slow and mellow kind of sound before kicking into, I think, one of the harder, heavier sections on this album. It's really close to what they did with Sunshower, but I don't think it works quite as well as that first song. The transition from the slow intro into the heavier section is almost too jarring. I think there's ways they could have done or blended that a little bit better to make that a better transition. Because I think one of the best things about the song is the softer dynamics of that intro. So I think, like I said, they could have blended that a little bit better and had that kind of woven through into the beginning of that harder section. I think the transition wouldn't have been as abrupt. And then the song Slow Dive is, I think, musically very similar to Soul, which is the second track on the album, where it has that very much this like glow on kind of feel to the song, maybe like it was a forgotten or unused track off of that album. The only difference is I think Soul is overall a better song. I mean, Slow Dive is still okay, but it's not quite as good as that first version of it. And then something that Turnstile is not really known for, it hasn't really done a whole lot throughout their career, is using more like pop punk kind of style. The song Time Is Happening I don't think it really is a pop punk song, but it's very reminiscent of that pop punk style. And like I said, I was a little surprised to hear something that sounded like that on this album, especially at this point in Turnstile's career. And then the album wraps up with the song Magic Man, which is very similar to the way the album started out, with that more ambient kind of style to it. But with the title track started off with that style and then quickly kind of progressed, Magic Man kind of stays in that for the entire song. So I guess looking back on the entire album as a whole, I guess I understand why they use the title track to start the album off, because you're going to end it with this kind of song. So at least it kind of bookends with that style. Overall, I don't think it's a perfect album. It definitely has its ups and downs, but I think the ups definitely outweigh the downs on this album. The songs are all well written. The production's really good on this album, even though it's a little overproduced at times. It's nothing that's really going to, change my overall feeling of the album. The album has that very nostalgic 80s kind of feel to the album, which is something that Ghost tried to do on their most recent album also. But, I think it works better on this album than, it did on anything that Ghost did on their new one. But I still don't think it worked quite as well as the band, I think, wanted it to on this one. I know Turnstile really kicked up that transition on Glow On, but I was surprised to see them progress so far away from their roots on this album and more towards that indie rock, pop rock kind of sound. Like I said earlier, I think it'll turn off some of their older fans, but I still think they're going to bring in enough new fans to offset that loss. Because I think the more accessible style of rock on this album, it plays well today. It draws in fans, it draws in newer fans, younger fans. So I think this album is going to do really well. I think at times this album is propped up by some really great songs, but overall it's a really good album. I think it's a really solid effort from Turnstile. I'd give it probably a 7.5 out of 10, which is better than the first time. My first time through this album, I was probably a firm 6. So it's definitely grown on me already the, 5 or 6 times I've listened to it since it was released. I always wrap up these review videos by talking about, is this an album that I would pick up a physical copy of? Probably. It's not a very expensive album. I think my local record store, I think, has it on sale for like 25 or 26 bucks. So I probably will grab a copy of it. It definitely is an album that I know I will listen to multiple times, enough to have a copy of it, I think. I think last time I looked online, there was, I think, like 14 or 15 different color variants of this album. I think there's also a alternate cover. It's still early in the year. I'm sure this album's going to grow on me by the end of the year. So when I make my, top 15 or top 20 list at the end of the year, this might show up on there. I'm just not really sure where at this point. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this new album from Turnstile. Have you listened to it yet? What would you rate it? Have you listened to any of the older stuff from Turnstile? Because that's one thing I'd love to know is, if you're an older fan of this band, if you listened to their first couple of albums, what do you feel about this transition that the band has done from that to Glow On, now to Never Enough? Because I don't think there's a lot of bands out there that have the guts to really do that and have such a drastic change in their style over just a couple of albums. And to be completely honest, I enjoy the stuff that's on Never Enough and Glow On more so than their first couple of albums. So maybe that's why I am so high on this new album, but I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.